It's hardly controversial to call this year's U.S. presidential election campaign the most bizarre in memory, but there may yet be more controversy once all the votes have been cast. Joining us now to reflect on the race and explain what happens if no candidate reaches 270 Electoral College votes, here's Paul Finkelman. He's professor at the University of Saskatchewan College of Law, the Ariel F. Sallows Visiting Professor of Human Rights Law. Good to have you back here in our studio.
It's a delight to be back. I love it here.
All right, I want to ask you, as a human rights law professor, give me your view on which of the two presidential candidates, quote unquote, would be better on protecting human rights.
Well, Hillary Clinton, without question.
Why do you say?
Well, for one thing, because she has a really strong record of protecting human rights as Secretary of State. You know, you look at her history. She graduated Yale Law School at a time when she could have gone to Wall Street and made a ton of money. Instead, she works for the Children's Defense Fund. She works for civil rights groups. She has a clear record of being concerned about people's lives. And Donald Trump seems to be concerned about how many people he can molest on the bus.
Donald Trump would say he is representing the rights and views of a lot of disenfranchised people who think the elites have forgotten all about them.
And that, coming from a multi-billionaire, is a really interesting position, isn't it? You know, if you or I had started out with a couple $1,000,000 from Daddy, we might be rich too.
12 or 13 or something.
Yeah.
How do you, okay.
And just be clear, the hypocrisy is so blatant on those kinds of issues. There are arguments to be made that people go to Washington and perhaps even come to Ottawa, I'm not sure, and they get out of touch with the people they represent. There are arguments to be made, certainly, that in a country as big as the United States, you know, we're 10 times the size of Canada in population, even though you have more space than we do. The government becomes bureaucratic, it becomes disconnected from people. A rule is in place which makes sense when it's in place until it applies for something that doesn't make any sense. And so people feel disfranchised, they feel angry. But that's very different than the campaign of Trump.
As you pointed out in that answer, and as we pointed out in the intro, you're a visiting professor here, so you are American. So,
I am from the States.
So
that's
you,
right.
Fair to say you vote Democratic every time out?
I voted for Republicans on occasion.
Okay.
I mean, I believe in honest government. I believe in good government. And there have been times when the Republican candidate has been the best candidate. And of course, there was a time when I was growing up when the Republican Party was an extremely different party. So I grew up in New York State. In fact, I grew up 20 miles from the Thousand Islands Bridge. I grew up watching Kingston, Ontario television. And at that time, the Republican Party had people who were moderate.
Well, you're a Rockefeller Republican.
Well, there were Rockefeller Republicans, there were Javits Republicans, there were in Illinois, there was Charles Percy. And the Republican,
we call them progressive conservatives here in Canada.
They would have been progressive conservatives. They might have been even liberal conservatives, if you could have such a thing. You know, it's important to remember that most of the Republicans in Congress supported the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. They're a very different party today.
Do you give Trump any marks for attempting to be the voice of tens of millions of Americans who feel disenfranchised and left behind by globalization?
No.
Why not?
Because he is, in fact, the embodiment of their problem. So that when you look at Trump clothing, it's made in Sri Lanka, it's made in India, it's made somewhere else, it's made somewhere else. When you look at the steel he buys for the buildings he builds, they're made in China, it's made in Korea. And when you look at his business operations of refusing to pay people that he owes, declaring bankruptcy, in the case of Trump Tower in New York, illegally hiring Polish immigrants who were not legally in the United States. And then when they complained, telling them if they complain about not getting what they were promised, he's going to report them to immigration and naturalization. So he, in fact, has taken advantage of all of globalization. He has made it worse over and over and over again. And then when things don't go well, he just declares bankruptcy.
Let me make sure I understand your position. You acknowledge the sincere and legitimate concerns of people left behind by globalization, but you don't think he's the solution.
I think he's the problem.
He's the problem.
He's the embodiment of the problem. But of course, the other piece of globalization is this, that no matter who is president, no matter who is Prime Minister of Canada, globalization is taking place. And whether we like it or not, there has been dramatic change in the world economy. Sometimes those dramatic changes help some people and not others. The reality is, if you look at, say, the steel industry, American steel was 100 years old as an industry or longer. They were dealing with factories that were 100 years old. Along comes countries
they let it get away from them.
Build brand new steel factories. I mean, if you want to blame somebody, blame the chief executives of General Motors and Ford and Chrysler, who persistently built cars that nobody wanted.
I hear you. I don't want to blame anybody, but I do want to find out what is going to happen to that cohort of tens of millions of Americans after the election if Donald Trump loses and they still feel a need to find somebody to champion their interests. What happens to that group?
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, maybe they'll become Bernie Sanders Democrats. I mean, the oddity is that both Sanders and Trump talked about these issues. And to his credit, Sanders forced Hillary Clinton to talk about these issues more than she had planned. The problem with globalization for industrialized countries like the United States and Canada is that we don't do a very good job of helping people transition to the next economy. And that's what we should be doing a much better job of.
Why do you think so many Americans don't care about the fact that Donald Trump is a pig who has boasted about sexually assaulting women?
I simply have no answer to that. I think part
of it,
I think part of it is that a number of people have decided they like Donald Trump or they hate Hillary Clinton, and there's a certain kind of irrational hatred about Hillary Clinton.
Where's that from?
Well, in part, it's from the fact that she's been an outspoken woman in politics for her whole life.
So some of it is gender discrimination.
A lot of it's gender discrimination. You know, when she was asked what she was going to do as the first lady when her husband was first elected, she said, "I'm not going to stay home and bake cookies."
Right.
Well, okay, she's going to go out there. She's going to go to Congress and work for health care. She is going to fight for issues. She raises issues over and over again. A lot of gender discrimination. A lot of men see Hillary Clinton as the reason why their world has changed, because she's the embodiment of some of this change. And you've got 30 years of people taking often insane shots that are not even cheap shots, but it builds and builds and builds, combined with the rise of a new kind of media, a right-wing media, and the internet media. I mean, one of the things that has never existed in the modern United States until very recently is the notion that you have a TV network that is blatantly partisan in its political perspective. Fox News.
You're talking about MSNBC?
I'm talking about Fox News.
Okay, so there's two actually. There's one dedicated to liberalism and one to conservatism.
Although MSNBC is not the main network, and it's a relatively small network, and it is certainly less biased in favor of Democrats than Fox News
is for Republicans.
Yeah. I'll give you one example of the Fox News. A few years ago, when the governor of South Carolina disappeared to run off with his Argentine mistress, and
Mark Sanford
disappears, and Fox News immediately puts up a picture of Mark Sanford, and it says, "Democratic governor of South Carolina does this." And they had it up for about a half hour before they realized there hasn't been a Democrat elected as governor of South Carolina in about 40 years. But for them, all scandals must be Democrats. Republicans can't have scandals.
But all right, I'm going to get back to my original question, though, which was why so many Americans seem to have so much distaste for Hillary Clinton. You told me there's gender discrimination, there's this, there's that, I understand.
She's clumsy.
Okay, I was just going to get to this because you're kind of letting her off the hook here
Oh,
for
no,
her being the author of much of her own misfortune.
She seems to have a great ability to lead with her left foot, lead with her chin, put her foot in her mouth, do things that are enormously clumsy. She has a tin ear for certain kinds of political activity. She is not a natural politician. I've always wondered why she wanted to run for public office. She is not somebody who appears to be comfortable shaking hands. Unlike her husband, you walk in, I've met Bill Clinton
No,
a
he's
few
born to
times.
do it, for sure.
You walk into the room and immediately all heads, all Martian antennas go to Bill Clinton. He is, if you Google charisma, Bill Clinton comes up.
Yeah, she's not a rock star in the same way.
And she's not comfortable in the role.
Yeah.
And that's part of it. So she always seems hesitant. And the other piece about her is that she's a very good lawyer, but she is sometimes overly lawyerish when she is in a political situation. So it seems as though she's representing the client Hillary Clinton when she's being asked a question, rather than being the authentic, warm, politically progressive, caring person who Hillary Clinton is.
Well, there's
But she doesn't come off that way because she is more like Hillary Clinton's lawyer than Hillary Clinton.
There's been a phenomenally charismatic and spectacular female as part of this campaign, but her name's Michelle Obama, not Hillary Clinton.
Well, there's been two. There's also been Elizabeth Warren, the U.S. Senator
And she's
from
been pretty good,
Massachusetts.
too. Yep.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, you're a professor.
I am.
So you're going to get inside the Electoral College and explain all this to us, because we understand.
Sure.
Look, we have elections in this country where the party that gets the most votes doesn't always win. Right. Usually they win, but it doesn't always work out that way. We remember from 2000, George W. Bush became president in spite of the fact that Al Gore got a lot more votes than he did. So we need to understand this Electoral College better.
Okay.
What is the Electoral College?
Okay, so start with this. The creation of the United States, 1787, you have states of varying sizes, varying populations, varying rules for who gets to vote. So for example, in Massachusetts, any adult male, black, white, Indian, poor, rich, landowner, not landowner, can vote. In South Carolina, only wealthy white men who are heads of households can vote. That's this huge disparity.
That's 200 and some odd years ago,
Yes,
right?
but so when they're putting the Constitution together, there is a big fight over whether you're going to have a popular vote of the president. And the Southerners particularly don't want this because 40 to 50% of their population are slaves who don't vote. So James Madison says at the Constitutional Convention, the best thing would be for the people to elect the president. The problem is our Negroes won't count, meaning our slaves won't count. So instead, they come up with this convoluted system called the Electoral College, where they allocate presidential electors to each state based on the number of senators they have, which every state gets two, and the number of representatives, which in those days was based on the whole population of free people and adding 3/5 of the slaves. This wasn't saying slaves were 3/5 of a person. It was saying that slaves are going to give a bonus to the Southerners on the 3/5 ratio. Southerners, of course, said, hey, we should have a full counting of the slaves. Give us more representatives in Congress.
So that's how the Electoral College started.
That's how it
basically,
started.
So it establishes
so
the fact that California and New York, for example, get a lot more electoral votes than Rhode Island or Connecticut.
Yes, but as a allocation of electoral votes per population, the smaller states have a huge advantage.
Okay, but don't take us off there yet. That's something else.
Okay. So the end result is we have this Electoral College, which means that it's theoretically possible, for example, for somebody to win all of the votes in the 15 largest states and not be elected president if the other candidate carried the 35 smallest states, even though those 15 states would have something like 67% of the population.
Got it.
Now this is never going to happen. This is just a mathematical
Okay,
moment.
but let's go through some. So just so we're clear
All
here,
right.
the people who vote in American elections don't actually vote for the presidential candidates. They vote for the electors of the presidential candidates.
I give a lecture and I say, how many of you voted for Obama? How many of you voted for John McCain? And then I say, no, none of you did. You all voted for presidential electors.
Exactly.
That's right.
Okay, so there's you got to get to 270 electoral votes to win.
Right.
It's actually, if you think about it, it's actually 51 elections, not one election, right? Because
It is essentially 51 separate elections.
50 states in the
plus
District of Columbia.
That's exactly right.
Okay, and this is, I doubt this is going to happen, but it's theoretically possible, so let's talk about it. In the state of Utah, there's a third-party candidate who may win.
He may carry Utah, that's right.
Which means it's theoretically possible that neither Hillary Clinton nor Donald Trump will reach the 270 electoral votes required to become president.
Yes.
If that happens, what happens?
Okay, if that happens, then the election goes to the House of Representatives, where each state gets one vote. And then it gets absurdly undemocratic, because California, with 37 million or 38 million people, gets the same vote as Wyoming with about 600,000 people.
And how does each state determine how to cast its vote?
Well, these members of the House of the delegation in the House of Representatives.
Oh, I see.
So all
So
the California members of the House get together, and the one person from Wyoming says, "Well, do I vote for him or do I vote for her?"
Got it. Yes.
Okay. So that's happened a few times, and it's an incredibly stupid, archaic system. It needs to be changed.
But no one's. Everybody says that every year, and yet there's never been any appetite to change it, and I suspect there never will be, because this is the way it's always been done.
It's very hard to amend the U.S. Constitution. There is a proposal out there called the National Popular Vote Bill. And this is very complicated, so fasten your seatbelt and stay with me for a minute. National Popular Vote says that when states that account for 60% of the Electoral College pass this bill, it goes into effect in all of these states that have passed the bill. And what the bill says is that the electors in those states will vote for the person who has the most popular votes in the country rather than how their state voted.
Smaller states would never go for that.
Well, some smaller states have.
Why would they? It takes the vote out of their hands in some respects, doesn't
Well, but the same thing with bigger states. I mean, for example, New York could vote Democratic, and a Republican could have the most popular votes, and the New York electors would then have to vote for the Republican. So it cuts in both directions. But what this is a way of making the Electoral College meaningless, because you would have all these people who are pledged to vote for the person who has the popular vote. Right now, as last time I looked, there's about 160 electoral votes. So they still have a ways to go. But both California and New York have passed this law. And who knows, maybe someday we'll have it.
And for an amendment to pass the U.S. Constitution, you need 3/4 of the state legislatures
you need 3/4
to pass
of the
it?
state legislatures.
Okay. Let's finish up on this. Every election, the pundits talk about, quote unquote, an October surprise.
Yes.
Something that shows up in the last couple of weeks of the campaign.
We just got one about 2 hours ago.
Yeah, I hear you. We may have just got one. The FBI has announced it is relaunching an investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails, which they are concerned are different enough from the emails that they have already investigated and exonerated her on. These are new emails with potentially more disturbing possibilities, and therefore they are relaunching the investigation. In your view, as a guy who's looked at American politics for the last half century, is this a significant enough new development to constitute the kind of October surprise that could affect the outcome of the election?
I don't think it is, and I don't think it will. I think, to quote Bernie Sanders, we're sick of her damn emails. and I think for most voters, this is going to be a meaningless thing. The Trump people are going to scream. You know, Donald Trump has already said jail her. By the way, this is the only time in American history where you've had a presidential candidate saying that he will prosecute his opponent if he wins. I mean, it's like he lives in
He said that in one of the debates.
A third world country. You know, Donald Trump has taken American politics to the level of a non-democratic dictatorship. It's like he thinks he's Mussolini rather than running for president of the United States. It's never, ever, ever happened before. And so now he's out there saying, you know, we need to jail Mrs. Clinton. I don't think anything's going to happen. First of all, the FBI is not going to give us an answer in 9 days. unless there are only like 7 emails or something. I don't know why it was announced, other than they've discovered it, and the director of the FBI felt that it is his job as a non-political, non-partisan law enforcement officer to announce this investigation.
Do you have a clear sense in your own head about what the final score of this election is going to be?
Before this morning, or before this news, I would have said the final score would be that Clinton would be somewhere over 300 electoral votes, maybe 330. I think it's possible that the news this morning could take 1 state or 2 states away from her that are very, very close. But I want to tell you something about these close
But she's
states.
over 270 for sure.
She's over 270, and the math on being over 270, it is simply impossible to figure out, given the electoral map, how Trump would win.
You think he can't get to 270?
I do not.
There's no map.
I don't think he can get to 270 unless he's rigged some state elections.
He's complaining about rigging. He's not rigging.
Yeah, I understand that. And here's the stupidity of this: that elections are run by local officials.
Yeah, it's all statewide.
It's countywide.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
county election judges.
But the federal government has nothing to do with it.
Only in the broad sense of saying who can vote, and investigating election fraud or.
But local officials run elections.
Local officials run
And
elections.
most of them are Republicans.
In many states there are. I mean, they had somebody on TV today from Iowa, which is as a Republican governor, a Republican Secretary of State. Most of the counties are Republican county officials, and they're saying our elections are as clean as you can get. And what Trump has done is insulted thousands and thousands of Republican office holders who are perfectly honest, decent people by saying they're running rigged elections.
You got a funny country there, Paul.
No question about it.
You know what? We always appreciate your visits to our studio, so thanks so much for doing it again.
It's a great pleasure to be here, and if things don't work out the way I'm predicting, you may see a lot more of me.
You're going to be one of millions of Americans coming up. Maybe we'll build a wall and make you guys pay for it.
Well, yeah, why not?
No, we'll take you. That's Paul Finkelman, the Ariel F. Sallows Visiting Professor of Human Rights Law at the University of Saskatchewan College of Law. Thanks, Paul.
You're welcome. Bye.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.